Yes.
I see you.
We're live.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Today we want to talk about one or two of the more confusing concepts from the domain-driven design realm. It's solution space and problem space and the distinction between them. And there was a very long discussion preparing this evening. I think it was started by Christina, Nick, and Dawn. I'm not sure, but there were a lot of people chiming in, and we realized it's not about domain-driven design. Problem space and solution space is a concept that is discussed in many communities. And so we have a few guests today. I'd like to introduce Indy Young and Jay Bloom, Dawn, Christina, Nick, recurring guests, and of course me and Kenny as moderators today. So feel free, everybody, to join the Miro board that is linked in the chat and ask your questions on YouTube and Zoom. And yeah, I want to open the floor to anybody who can try to explain to us what a solution space and problem space is. Maybe starting with Indy.
I can start. So I'm coming at it. I've got a far in the past background in computer science, which has switched into user experience. So I'm coming at it from the point of view of the whole reason we're making software. And in the very beginning, we made software to sort of embody processes or methods so that we could make the computer do the thing that we wanted it to do instead of having us do it manually, which took forever. And that has morphed a lot in the past 30 years. We're still trying to do a little bit of that, but we are also doing a lot of, well, what is the person trying to get done and how do we help them get that done? Hence the smartphones and everything. We're surrounded by little things that want to help us get something done, and they interrupt us a lot and they frustrate us a lot. And they don't really help us get the thing done that we want to get done. We all have these experiences every day. And mainly that's because the design behind them is we're not taking time to understand what is it that person wants to get done from a person's point of view. So in a way, that's where we get close to domain, but it's not exactly domain. Domain probably comes from that background of we used to write algorithms to represent the way things work so that humans didn't have to do them anymore. And that still exists. So I think that's still totally valid. I'm just explaining that I'm coming from this other place where what we're trying to do is help a person get their thing done more effectively and maybe invisibly or seamlessly if possible. Without the terrible frustration. The other half of it is that a lot of the tools that we're making actually harm people. Whether that harm is making it so that they can't buy insurance or get health care, or whether that harm is that they feel unwelcome or unsupported or unheard, it's still harm. And so there are a lot of people trying to work on ways to pay better attention so that people feel as if this is made for them. And with that, I just finished eating some almonds, so of course they're in my throat. So what we're trying to do is understand different people's approaches. So trying to understand thinking styles, try to understand the different things that different people do, and be more careful and cognizant of what we create to help them. So this is outside of the area where we're just trying to make an algorithm that embodies a process. What we're trying to do is help people. So I've got a whole bunch of diagrams here. And that first diagram, and it's kind of fun seeing like the hive of little cursors flying around it, like flies around a pile of, But anyway, this first diagram is a very early diagram of mine, trying to lay out the way I see a lot of orgs working, where we're focused on coming up with ideas and we're focused on turning those ideas into really good software or solutions or services or whatever. And so we're using various methodologies. I have drawn here in the right-hand side under solution space, something called continuous dual track. I didn't make up that diagram. I didn't make up that process. It consists of 2 cycles that are going in parallel, and they're handing off to each other through a product backlog. So probably that sounds familiar to people. The ideas from it are coming from something in that brown space, just in the middle, from the opportunity backlog. That thing gets filled either by jobs to be done or lean or agile. But often those places that the ideas are coming from are still not paying attention to the differences that people bring to the way that they try to solve their problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't necessarily solving a problem. It's sometimes just making progress on it. Maybe you are a watercolor painter, and so you go in and you paint on the thing a little bit every day. Maybe you're trying to do your taxes. You're not going to do it all in one big sit down. Maybe you are that type of person that does it all in one big sit down. Sometimes you're not. Maybe you do it because in little bits because you've got your kids at home. So there's all these different kinds of approaches to every purpose. So instead of talking about it as a domain, like tax preparation, I think of it from the person's point of view, which is the person's purpose. And so the purpose might be file my taxes at kind of the umbrella level, but there might be different purposes involved, like try to find all the documents that I need, try to make time, try to balance doing this with my partner, try to balance doing this with the fact that my kids are at home. There's a bunch of other kinds of purposes that are related to it. And those might be things that you discover if you sat down and just listened to that person. So when I try to understand the problem space, that's that one little circle there, I sit down and listen to people. I do a non-directed interview, and I call it listening deeply. And what I'm after is not an explanation of what they're doing. I'm not after the explanation of the steps that they're using. I'm not after their opinions and preferences or statements of fact about what exists and how they launched something. Instead, all that's going to be in the stories that they tell me, but I encourage them to go deeper so that I can get what is in their mind, what's going through their mind, what's their inner thinking, what are their emotional reactions, and what did that set off in their mind? Maybe more emotions, maybe more thinking, or maybe we ask about guiding principles, and guiding principles are kind of the operating system that people run on. And you're continually updating your operating system, but there are still rules in there from your kindergarten teacher. And your mom or whatever. So that's the depth that I'm after, those 3 things: inner thinking, emotional reactions, and guiding principles. So the reason for those 3 things is that how you form cognitive empathy. And once I have that understanding, and if I've framed my study properly, you have to pay a lot of attention to framing your study properly, then patterns will come out. And those patterns will have to do with that purpose. It'll have to do maybe with the file my taxes, but I will have organized the way I did the research in a certain way so that we're looking in a certain direction. It's not everybody. It's not corporate taxes and individual taxes. It's not all individual taxes. It's a certain subset that we're interested in right now, because if we look too broadly, we won't get patterns. And the patterns are the definition of validity when you do qualitative data. So out of this pops 2 things for a purpose, and it's framed by a purpose rather than a domain because it's person focused. So out of this pops an opportunity map, which is across the top, it looks like a city skyline. There's a bunch of towers, and in those towers, and I've got a bunch of these on my website we can download, in those towers are little windows, and in each window is a person. It's a statement from that person that starts with a first person present tense verb about their inner thinking, or about some emotion they're having, or about some guiding principle that they're applying in that case. And in that opportunity map, that city skyline, we don't come at it and say, well, these parts all fall under this tag that we've made up. Instead, we work from the bottom up, which is a very computer science kind of an idea. We're working from the bottom up. We're letting the data say what it has to say. We're finding the affinities between each inner thinking and everybody else's inner thinking, and how does it sort of relate within the idea of the focus of mental attention. So there's towers, there's windows with the little people in them. The towers end up getting grouped from the bottom up into blocks, like a city skyline with blocks. And then those blocks sometimes form neighborhoods. And just like a city, it isn't like somebody came and said, okay, this is how the city's going to be, unless you're talking about Mormon city. Really good podcast on that. But the city kind of grows based on what is there and who sets the culture and stuff. So this is the top city skyline is a very person-oriented point of view as the person's trying to accomplish a purpose. The other part of it, the lower half of it, is the org itself, kind of mapping what they're doing in support of these different towers. So you can see where the gaps and the weaknesses are and decide whether that's something your org wants to help with. The second thing that comes out of this is thinking styles. So this is different philosophic approaches. So you might have that tax person who's who falls within the study, who's like, you know, I just want to get it all done in one fell swoop. This is how I've always done it. I spent weeks gathering everything I know, and then I'm going to close the door and like do it all. Versus a different approach, which is like, I'm going to dabble at it as I go. And then like right before the deadline, I'm going to push it in. So there's different philosophic approaches to it, if you can get my drift there. And I'm making up these examples as we go. So they might not be completely well thought out. But if we go to that second diagram, the second slide here, I've just got two that are not diagrammatic. And this is a definition of purpose. So as opposed to a domain, which would be some, I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, the tax domain, the purpose is the person's objective. Like, what am I trying to make progress on? What am I trying to get done here? And it could involve making a decision. It could involve actually doing something. It could involve planning. It could involve organizing memories from the past. It can be anything. And the interesting thing is that when you take a purpose and you take like a certain context, let's say the purpose is filing your taxes, but the context is, hey, I all of a sudden started working for myself this year instead of working for someone else. Now I've got a new kind of set of forms I have to fill out, maybe. And then I might be changing my philosophic approach, my thinking style. Maybe before I was a sit it down and get it all done person when I was employed, because it was pretty easy. It's just like grab these documents, stick them in the form, and then we're done. But now that I'm working for myself, I have to figure out something like whatever they call that thing where if you buy a piece of equipment, you write it off over a series of years. So there's a difference in context plus purpose and thinking style. So those three things together mean that you're not going to have one overarching solution, one overarching diagram that covers everybody who ever files taxes. It's going to be a diagram that shows a certain part of it. And then you go and do some more research a year or two later and add to that diagram. And it might fill it out in different ways. So the example there I did was with, we did 8 studies for an airline over the course of a bunch of months. It was very compressed. Usually it's years. Should have been like, 8 years, one study a year. But we ended up with soup to nuts, like realizing that I need to get to another place and deciding whether I really want to do that, all the way through to figuring out what it takes to get there, deciding how I'm going to get there, making a reservation, changing the reservation, figuring out how I'm going to get to the airport on time, all the thoughts that go into when you're at the airport, when you're in the airplane, and then picking up your luggage, etc., and then taking care of like issues that happened. So that is like a bigger, fuller picture that you would have over the years as you add to it. And people keep asking me, like, can't we just do this for like the insurance industry? And then everybody in the insurance industry will be able to use that one diagram. And it doesn't really work that way because different insurance companies attract different thinking styles. So yeah, there might be some shared parts of it for sure, but it's going to be slightly different. So that's what I mean by looking at it from a person's point of view. And that's how it relates. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for that. So you write a singular, a person's aim, intent, and objective. Would you say that problem space always focuses on a single person, or could a group of people be the thinking entity that has a problem space?
The data always comes from a single person because what we're after is telepathy with them. And we have to use a listening session because there's no telepathy server yet. But they could be in collaboration with others. Each person brings their own brain to that collaboration. And we could definitely do listening sessions with everybody in that group that's collaborating individually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Part of the other reason I do that is because it's a little bit, that session is an exposure. You're making yourself vulnerable. You're admitting to certain ways that you think and certain guiding principles you use. And you may not feel comfortable talking about it that openly with a group. And so that's why I collect the data individually. As soon as it's collected, it's divorced from its identity, so that there's none of that privacy issues. We're just looking at the concepts. That's another reason why I do that. The other thing that I wanted to say is that this purpose can apply. So that early diagram, that first one, the purpose can apply across both the problem space and the solution space. And so I made up a bunch new, the blue images. I do have a couple of examples that we might want to look at if you scroll along. Yeah, the one there with the pet store and the vacation lodging. You just went past it. There it is. Nope. There. Oop. This one. It's one. Yeah. It's just to the right. It has pet store on it. Look for pet store. Just scroll up a little. There you go. You see pet store now? And in vacation lodging, you got it. Yep. So, so I just gave some examples of purposes in the solution space and the problem space. I'm looking at it from the lens of a pet store just to help you see the difference. So if I was a pet store, a person who comes and interacts with me one way or another may have some purposes, such as I want to find out if the vet recommended some sort of brand and I need to get it. Do you sell it here? Or maybe I'm in an actual physical store and I need help carrying something heavy. So that could be a purpose. I might want to ask for recommendations at a pet store. I might want to set up a subscription for some pet food. Whereas if you scroll to the problem space side, when you look at it from a person's point of view in the problem space, it's a little less oriented to the pet store. The way that you can understand that your purpose is in the problem space versus the solution space is that it can be achieved using a lot of different tools. So make it more comfortable and safe for my pet to come out on a walk with me. You might be thinking about certain neighborhoods you don't want to walk through with your pet. You don't want to walk through past that one house where that dog comes out barking all the time. Or you might be thinking of a reflective vest that you want to buy for your dog because you like to walk at night. Or the second bullet there is convince my sick or finicky pet to eat something. You got to scroll over to the left just a little bit. And when you are facing a sick or a finicky pet, you will use your memory. Like, what did that pet like to eat before? Oh, I remember that they really liked salmon. So I'm going to go buy some salmon. I'm going to cook up salmon for myself, but also feed it to my cat. And that doesn't have to do with a pet store. Or you might remember that they liked condensed milk. You might run into your basement and see if you've got any condensed milk stored away there and pour them some condensed milk. Give my pet joy or amusement. You can solve that purpose with a variety of things. And you're just going to the dog park, maybe introducing your kids to new ways you could play with the pet. And then make my pet feel included. Definitely lots of different ways you can do that probably don't involve a pet store at all. So that's kind of fun to look at that example. I've also got a vacation lodging example that you can look at if you're interested, but in the interest of time, if you just move to the right a little bit, the purposes in the problem space, like I said, you can tell it's in the problem space because you can achieve that purpose with a lot of different tools. They could be mental tools or social tools like, your kids, or digital tools or mechanical tools or, any kind of thing. Whereas in the solution space, we're looking through the lens of our org. So instead of thinking of it as like, let's go back to the tax example. The tax example, you can see like in the problem space, you might have like a piece of paper and a pencil and your calculator, to do your taxes. It doesn't have anything to do with anybody's actual digital solution. The calculator certainly is a mechanical tool, I suppose. It's digital on the inside, but we'll call it mechanical for now. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do your calculations. Whereas if you are Intuit or something, you have processes and you're trying to get somebody to use your processes to calculate their taxes without having to do the calculations, just by filling in the pieces of information that are necessary. Or even just by browsing that information from the data that the person had been entering throughout the year using some of your Intuit tools. So this is a great segue to that next blue slide that has that circle in it. And this is a draft version update of that original one where I'm trying to talk about how a person, so purpose is that key. And a person trying to accomplish that purpose, there in the center, is doing some thinking about it, is having some emotional reactions about it, and is making decisions based on their guiding principles. So that's the problem space in there. Whereas the ring around it are all the different tools that that person can apply in making progress on their purpose. So they might dial it around and they might like ask their neighbor. There's an icon of a person and the little speech bubble. So they might kind of remember what they learned in university, or they might go to a search engine, or they might use some sort of manual tools or some digital tools on their phone. They might put on some music to help them accomplish this thing. And so what we're seeing is that your org, if you've got one of those digital tools that runs on the phone, is just got this one little aperture that they're using to look at the person trying to accomplish their purpose. And if we want to understand that person in more depth and that richness of the different people's approaches and the different people's thinking styles, we need to kind of open up that aperture to kind of understand it. The next one to the right of this one just shows that a lot of these things that are in that ring of tools that I can use to accomplish my purpose have orgs behind them. And each org has that little aperture to see that person accomplishing that purpose. So the university that's behind your degree had that little aperture in the way of like putting information into your brain. And that's how they thought about it with regard to you being able to do some future purposes. And this next one that's brown, I'm just still kind of working on it. This is in a way, the wrong way that we're looking at it. In a way, we're thinking of ourselves, our org and our app at the center, and the people around us, and we're like breaking them down by demographics, which has nothing to do with the way that they think, except in certain cases. And those certain cases are in discrimination and physiology. But a lot of the time, we don't address it that way. And the next one, it was the next blue one is the way, going back to having the person in the center, we're just looking, we're pretending that person is this generic user, right? We're not trying to understand what their purpose is. We're only looking at them through the lens of our solution and what we can do to help them. And we're ignoring all those other orgs out there and their little aperture visions. To see that there's a lot more tools out there that a person can use to make progress on their purpose. So that next slide is going back to double down on what I said earlier, is that a person's purpose is contextual. So it changes. It changes often with life events. It changes with different goals, larger goals that you might have in mind. So my little icons here, I was like, a person's planting something. Maybe their purpose is to get out in nature more, or maybe their purpose is to grow their own food, or to have a beautiful yard, all sorts of different larger purposes, and they may shift. They may shift over time, they may shift with where you live. And that isn't being taken into account with regard to the way that we look at people trying to accomplish their purpose. We're just looking at them as a generic user that's trying to use our app. And we're trying to help them do the thing that we know how to help them do. I think there's a couple more slides that
so
are,
I'm wondering what, well, looking at the DDD practitioners amongst our panel before we maybe move on, but how does that relate to the current problem versus solution space to the DDD or so? I'm curious. So maybe Nick, Marco, Christina, Tom, perhaps.
I think Indy makes a good point, how the focus of software development has probably changed over the past few decades, going from automating processes to a very transactional. User has a problem, we go build a solution over a number of years in a waterfall approach, to we're continuously understanding our use better and developing tools to help them achieve not their goals but their purposes in more of a continuous fashion. And so I would say this definition makes problem space a lot clearer. And I think most of domain-driven design is the strategy and solution space, I would say. And I think that, to me, that makes sense if we went with that definition of things.
Yeah, I would agree strongly. The last few slides were based on one assumption, I think, saying that we only perceive the user or the person as a single user. I think specifically in domain-driven design, there's a culture of actually trying to understand the role and the context that the user is in. But I'm still curious about the question I asked before, if it's only a problem space surrounded around one person, or if it's around a group of people. Because what I find is when we do domain-driven design analysis of companies that we try to build solutions for, we take into account the whole group of people, like all the stakeholders, and try to understand in which context do they want to achieve what, and their part of the domain, their way of thinking, their purpose they actually try to achieve is what I find to be the problem space. And the solution space for me always was like the amount of possible solutions that we can pick from. It's like the mental models that we work in to help them achieve their purpose, but it's never reduced to a single person. It is always towards the company or the team or the group of people that we try to help.
That's kind of the next slide, was thinking styles. So rather than thinking of them as a role or a team, I approach them by thinking style. So that I was just talking to somebody yesterday about people who are building APIs versus people who are using APIs as the purpose. But even if you're building an API, it doesn't matter what, I mean, it might matter who or what kind of API environment you're trying to build for, but you probably bring a certain thinking style to it. And people in different organizations might share that thinking style with you. And so if we can understand what the thinking styles are and recognize them, I think that's a really great use of machine learning for the future as a part of our interface designs, to recognize somebody's behavior and say, oh, I think you're this thinking style. We actually have a different solution for you that's geared more toward this thinking style, and say, hey, would you like to try that one out? And over time, build our understanding of what the different thinking styles are so that we can build different approaches, exactly what you're saying, Marco.
I'll say one thing, Marco, and Indy mentioned this. The information comes from individuals, and if you have enough, then you start to see commonality.
Yeah.
What I've observed is, because we are rushing, we want to do things quickly, or we get agreement, then we make an edict and say, that is the commonality, that is the singularity, that is what everybody, you know, those are the types or the audiences or the people. And we need to take a bit more care to do that, and also allow for the fact that we may not necessarily cover everybody, and be prepared to go back and add. And I think that domain-driven design has been an attempt to add it back in, that variety, where we're now sort of tripping over things. And it's been a very interesting, I think, learning year for me, just coming into this community as well, is we're talking about the same things, but with different words. So
right.
half of our problem is, okay, I said A, do you mean big A or small a, and all of that? And then once we have an understanding, then we can progress. So it feels like 2 steps back before going forwards. So
Yeah.
the commonality is there, but we need to seek it out and justify it. I will not accept that somebody says, oh, that's the way. As soon as I hear that Admiral Hopper, it's always been this way type declaration, then you have lost me, because we are more people on this planet than we have ever been. You cannot tell me that we're reduced to 5 or 6 or 10 types. So whilst you're talking to the business, I would be curious, did you talk to the business's customers? The people who are going to use the system.
So that's an interesting question where you see Trond asking, right? What you said. Curious about, well, Marco said, do we really have an intimate relationship with the user in DDD? Don't see that often, to be honest. Domain expert, yes. Internal stakeholders, but rarely see the user. So here's also what I'm wondering, right? Indy, you said you make individual conversations with users.
Mm-hmm.
While I see in domain-driven design a thing called collaborative modeling, which is, well, it's how do you say it? It doesn't match what you're saying to an event story. So well, I'm curious what people think about that.
I have a very strong opinion about that. So I think it totally depends on who you're talking to while you are doing modeling with domain-driven design, right? There are some people, as Dawn said, who want to rush to a quick solution, who want to get their hands on the keyboard or whatever building tools. And there are those who actually want to understand all the different stakeholders and want to dig deeper to find out, hey, did we actually get everybody? I mean, there are often very important people who are silent for whatever reasons, power play status, never been heard before, whatever, maybe a too complex opinion for other people to understand, whatever the feeling there is. And it's hard to have one session to get everybody's opinion with the same weight to the wall. So this is where methods like event storming come in and aid you or help you. It's not the only tool, and it's not the only one you should use, of course. But collaborative modeling sessions where you actually talk to people, and when you get new needs, new ideas, maybe just challenging ideas, saying, hey, I see nobody actually wants to go this path. Is just no stakeholder here interested in it, or didn't we explore that? All those different purposes, needs, and different ideas, they belong into the problem space. So this is where problem and solution space, for me, are a very important thing to distinguish and to make it a visible distinction, to say all these ideas we're putting on here, all the developers throwing out solutions to the problem, great, that's already solution space. Now we have all these nice things you all want to build. You want to get your hands on the code and start building your cloud-based whatever solution. But did we get all the problems yet? I mean, are we actually solving the right thing? And are we solving it in the right way? So not stopping the solution thinking, but making it transparent that we are doing it in solution space right now, and then getting back to problem space to figure out what's missing. This is never a just do problem space first, once you're done, do solution space discussion. That's not how thinking works. There are those programmers and even business people who only think in solutions. There are those who only think in problems, and you need a good facilitator or group experience coming over time to actually get better at distilling out both and getting more and more finer grained details into, hey, what did we miss? So this is why heuristics are so important, because there is no single way that gets you to successful modeling in the end, but you can get better over time. And I actually think that there are a lot of people who model in the right way, or in a successful way, that really dig into the problem space, try to understand what are the needs of the people, what are the needs of the organizations, where do they actually differ, because some people want to go here, some want to go here, some want to go here. So the vector in the middle is kind of like there, but some people really want to go in some other place. Did we hear them? Do we agree not to deal with their problem, or do we just delay it? Or making a conscious decision about this as a group, as an organization, is very important. And to me, all that is still problem space. That is all the purposes and needs and different perspectives of the people we're trying to help. And then there are all the solutions. Some we came up with in the first 5 minutes, some we came up with after we heard everything else, but all this is solution space. And no matter where my idea pops up, I have to put it into the right frame, because for every problem, we can find multiple solutions. And yeah, and end of monologue, sorry. Lost my train of thought now.
I see, wait, Don, before Christina's raising her hand already for a while, so.
Jabe, I don't know who was first.
You were, Christina. Go ahead. Then we
My
can
heads
go to
were
Jabe
up and down, up and down. I think what Trond asked, what Marco said, what Don said, it's just exactly where we are now. Sure, earlier or even today, we don't talk with our customers, but we are sitting here. Nick had these questions because we want to know. We know it's not enough. This is an evolution. We never thought until now, until a few years ago, we never thought about the customer. We just automated stuff for being paid. That's it. It was a job and nothing more. And it was a very good job because it was fun, but we didn't care about the end user. We just had something cool to do. It was very nerdy, and why not? We weren't mature or curious enough. We hadn't have enough energy to look in the system, to have this system curiosity, which is happening now. And until yesterday, I called this needs or problems, but now I say the purpose is an even better way, and we are learning the whole day, the whole time, and I think we are just there. Sure, before now it wasn't an issue. It wasn't because it weren't so much computers, it weren't so much software. Now we have software everywhere, and now we have users and customers and people who are shouting at us because we are making wrong software.
Right.
So we have to understand this.
Yeah, this is everything that both you and Marco said is, we are. I just posted a couple of thinking styles that I'll go into, but I think Jabe had some questions that I did of software designers, because I am a software designer at heart too. I know that there's great passion.
So I liked Indy's ideas quite a bit. I think they're really useful. I like to kind of propose a subtly different way of kind of looking at the thing, just really quickly. one of the ways to look at the problem that we kind of are pointing at is if we start with the idea of human-centered or user-centered design, kind of focus on who's the user, the questions tend to be like, what is the user's problem? What are we trying to solve for the user, right? And then we get this kind of like match between problem and user. And we get this natural tendency when we analyze problems like this to try to define who that user is more and more clearly. Like what do they look like, blah, 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 blah. One of the ways to kind of avoid this initial problem, right? Like, and eventually you have to get there because you are going to end up trying to make a tool for a person to solve a problem. That's almost always what we do. We do some sort of instrumental work eventually. But at first, the first blush version of this might be, who has the problem? Okay, stop. Where do they have the problem? When do they have the problem? Who else is there? So that what you're doing is you're trying to not describe the user anymore, and you're not even describing the problem anymore. You're trying to describe a problematic situation, a context in which the problem arises, right? Because one of the things that happens is if you go purely instrumental too quickly, in my estimations at least, and you start trying to design tools to solve the problem, you get what Akoff calls solutioning, which he argues is not the optimal version of system intervention. His optimal version of system intervention is to change the situation so that the problem does not arise at all. So instead of giving someone a new tool, how do you actually reconfigure the situation entirely so that the problem the person's having right now doesn't occur at all? Now, not all problems lend themselves to dissolution, but if you take an instrumental approach from the very beginning, you take that kind of approach from the very beginning, you end up, I think, in a bit of a trap, right? And I think this kind of is reflective of the fact that kind of problem solution thinking emerged from organizational research theory, which emerged from kind of C.I. Lewis's pragmatism, and that's also kind of the source of things like Deming's conceptions of lean and blah, blah. Like there's a whole set of theory that goes back to this idea of pragmatism as being kind of like the thing, but we lose a lot of what was intended with the kind of pragmatic principles that these things kind of started with, I think. So I think one of the ways to like think through this is it's very important to understand who you're trying to solve a problem for, but instead of initially focusing on that person or that type or archetype or finding literally where does this happen, and then go and look at where it's happening. Literally look at the context and the situation first, as opposed to trying to define your user more clearly. And one of the last things, this part of the rant is that in my experience, one of the things that you kind of end up realizing doing process design and process theory inside of organizations is that often there are people involved in the problem that are unaware of them, that they are the cause of the problem for someone else. They just don't know. They don't observe it. They're there. They're there when in the environment or in the context. They are there when it happens. They just don't see it because it's not their thing to look at. Getting their view on it, getting an understanding of it can be really helpful. And understanding that these contexts and problem spaces are reproduced. They're not static. They have something is making the problem reoccur. If it was so problematic, it would break the company and the company wouldn't exist anymore, right? So somehow this problem exists in a larger context that allows the problem to be reproduced, right? And so if we start from these assumptions, problems are reproduced, problems are in a situation or in a context. We need to understand the situation and context. Then we can understand things like users and tools and things like that can be applied towards either directly attacking the problem or modifying the context so the problem doesn't exist anymore. Then the solution space is basically bound by the context or the constraints of the problem space, so that this is my biggest pet peeve with the two space concept, right? I think problem space is describing a real thing that's actually occurring. It's a realism. It is a real thing that is actually happening. Solution space is idealism. It's literally like the search space of possibilities. Problem space in my mind at least, shouldn't be thought of as being like a place to search for problems. It is a place that exists and it causes problems. Yeah. And the difference between these means that if you understand the problem space, you will understand the constraints on what the solution space is, like what it could be. And therefore, your solution space will be limited by the actual current conditions as opposed to imagined things. I don't know. That's my rant.
So super close to what I just put in at the bottom.
I just want to say, this funny story. This actually happened, and it relates to what Jabe said. Mm-hmm. I worked in a data center, setting them up, and every Friday, this particular rack would go down. We stripped it down, we replaced the cable, we replaced the discs, and guaranteed every Friday. So then we started, I said, okay, look, this is ridiculous. We've replaced it 3 times and it's still happening. It cannot be the rack. And it was 1 rack out of 10. So it wasn't the electricity or anything else. So I asked, when does this happen? Because you get all the signals and everything. It's probably the first thing we should have done. Like you were saying, when and where does it happen? It happened almost the same time every Friday, but it took a while for it to cascade and fail because it was a resilient system, and then we'd get the signals at different times, and that's what we reacted to. And then eventually pinpointed and worked out, and we couldn't understand because this was a super secure, I mean, you almost strip search before you could go in. So it's like, so how is this happening? And then we started doing shifts at that time. Second Friday, the first one we didn't catch because the person went out for coffee and then it happened. Second Friday, I was there, and this lady comes in with one of those floor polishers and pulls out the plug. That plug is not supposed to be where it is. This was her legit panel. She has been trained and supervised and everything. This is her panel for plugging in all her things. Pulls out the panel, plugs in her 2 things, does her floor polishing and all the rest of it, and then vacuums through and empties the vacuum because nobody can go into the data center cell. And then plugs it back, but that's at least half an hour. And the whole thing at that point has collapsed and you go into the whole cascade. So she pulled out the plug, and I was like, that's totally fine. It's not within my cell remit. And then I started hearing the alarms. We went in, and she says, then I came out, sweating and everything. I said, this happens every Friday. And that was the root. So basically the electrician hadn't wired it up properly. That plug was on the wrong circuit. Every time she unplugged that, it cascaded through all and affected just 1 rack. And this is a real story. We spent at least $50,000 on hardware before we nixed that as the problem, because that's the convention. Those were the options. And then to Indy's point, we started doing guerrilla social, going low tech to try and find it. It's anecdotal now. This caused us hell. And I use that story as a lesson. When I was, a technical architect, and even now I'm a designer, you cannot beat 1 human beings. Whether, to your point, Jabe, it was unintended, the electrician wasn't even there anymore, but it cost us at least, and God knows who else, $50,000 because the plug was wired in the wrong place.
And I think like one of the ways to think through it a little bit is to think about, like, people think they want to know who the user is so they can kind of build a model of the user so that they can test against the model of the user, right? That's like a common way that people think through design, I think. Design thinking, or user-centered design, or human-centered design. One of the ways to like avoid that a little bit is to say, what we really want to know is how to find people to test our solution with. That's all we want to know. Literally, we want to know, how do we find people that when we come up with a solution, we can give them the solution and say, does this work for you? So is it easier or harder to describe the exact people you need to look for, or describe where and when the problem happens, and then just go there and be like, hey, you, you're here. Would you test this for me? It's an easier way of like evaluating. If you're taking a hypothesis-driven approach, and your assumption is part of human-centered design's assumption is that the end user will be the one who validates whether the problem is solved or not. That's one of the theories, right? Well, how do you find that end user? Describe where they are and what they're doing and when it happens, and then go there and find whoever happens to be there. That's your user. I think it's less likely to erase people. It's less likely to have people disappear because you're trying to describe an idealized thing or an idealized person. That's all.
So yeah. Oh, sorry. It reminded me really quick about a movie in 1999 in the Netherlands, where they asked people on the streets, mobile phones, will you use them? And everyone said no. Well, we all know how that escalated quickly.
What I wonder is from Jabe's examples, and also from the funny story from Don, is so going to the actual place, perceiving, looking at the people, and actually getting your eyes on the factory floor to see how the process is working instead of making educated guesses. That's a great idea, but you cannot observe everything, and you can't observe it objectively. So you're always subjective with your own pair of eyes and your own mental model. So what heuristics do you have to sharpen your vision to get a broader perspective?
But so like the traditional lean version of this, by the way, the answer is like, go to the Gemba, show respect, and ask why. So the idea of that frame is to say, you're not going there to observe and figure the problem out like, these idiots can't figure out how to do this right, I'm going to go fix it for them. You're actually going there to say, like, please tell me what you see, because I need to understand this situation better. And you are here. You have been in this situation. You know what happens before I get here and after I leave here. So part of what I'm saying is not to go and evaluate the domain, if that's what you guys want to call it, or the problem space analytically or objectively. Instead, you're going because that's where the people are who can tell you more about the problem that's happening, right? And it's subtle. It's a subtle difference, but I think it's important to think about that. I mean, if you go look at like Deming, for instance, or Short, or any of these guys who came up with these kind of analytical organizational research methods, one of the things they said is that if you didn't personally collect the data, you probably don't understand it, and you shouldn't use it. You should go talk to the person who collected the data. If you didn't collect it, you probably don't understand the operational constraints that generated the data in the first place. So even that initial quantitative attempt to create abstraction and move away from the context, at least for Deming and Short, the guys who originally were doing these things lean that became agile and blah, 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 they thought that you couldn't do that. You can't, that it's inappropriate to attempt to abstract that stuff away. And you have to go back and talk to the people who made the data in the first place to understand it well enough.
Thank you. Indy.
Yeah, interesting. I think we have a couple of things going on in terms of definition of problem. But I just threw something when Jabe was talking in here, which is sort of my latest December thinking around this triad of purpose, context, and thinking style. Observation doesn't mean that you can understand what a person's thinking. But to Marco's point, I'm not interested in individuals thinking, but I'm interested in the patterns across a lot of people that define differences. And that's what I call thinking styles or archetypes. And I've put a couple of examples of them up there, but I don't know how to open them up and lay out those slides like you guys did. But I thought that I would show those. But that idea, what Jabe was saying, that's where I've been thinking too, is that we have to connect that triad of the purpose. I say purpose instead of problem, the context, and the thinking style. But the thinking style it's not a role. It can't be a role because we make assumptions about roles, and assumptions are bad. That's where our bias comes in. That's where we start harming people. So thinking style comes from research. It comes from actually going to listen to people deeply to understand their philosophic approach to a particular purpose. And since there are multiples of those, like in that example that I was doing with the little icons above, there's a person growing something, but you could have different thinking styles. Like, I'm just going to use the way that our forebears have grown things. And I'm not going to try anything newfangled. Or I'm going to try to make this super commercialized so I can do it really big. Different thinking styles. So the one example that I put here, this first one in blue or turquoise, is the results. It's a very old study, but it was with people trying to solve bugs. And within an API, basically, trying to solve bugs while using somebody's SDK. And so the results that we got were that there were 3 different sort of philosophic approaches. The one that you're zoomed into is like what we call the team and crowd player. This is somebody who focuses on consensus and talks to a lot of people and tries to collect a lot of different approaches to solving what is going wrong with the way that they're trying to use the SDK, and maybe interact with the vendor of that SDK so that they can make updates to it or something. Some of them are proactive, others may not have the expertise to play a proactive or leadership role. So even within the one archetype, the one thinking style of team and crowd player, there's a different variety, right? But we're just talking about the archetype in general. My archetype descriptions are generally only 3 sentences or 4 sentences long. Let's see, zoom in on one of the other ones, and because there are 3 of them. Respected expert, yeah, that was one. There were only a few of them in our data, and we didn't do follow-on studies, so we haven't validated this for sure, but this is the person who is really good at what they do. And so when they run into some sort of trouble, they don't doubt themselves at all. I could go on about that. Just look at the other. Oh yeah, we've got all the way to the left, I think, is the last one. I don't have it for some reason on my screen. It's not updating. And so it might have moved.
It's doing it my way.
Ah, there we go. Yeah, this is the person who has super strong opinions about how it should be done. Again, they're self-confident. They don't necessarily reach out to others. And they're gonna sort of like go through their own little heuristics to make it work. And the interesting thing, though, was that across all 3 of these in the opportunity map, there was this huge section in the middle of the opportunity map, which was give back. I don't have the opportunity map, give back to others. And everybody was talking about how, like, I've got 5 minutes before this meeting, I'm going to run onto Stack Overflow and answer some questions, or every month I go to this certain meetup and I help people through with code reviews or something. This one that you're zoomed in on now was just the before and after. When we go to recruit for a study, we have to have ideas of thinking styles that we want to cover. And so the ones in bright green are what we thought we knew, and the ones in blue are the actual from the data. Not corroborated because we only did 1 study. You would want to do a couple more studies to make sure. But if you look at the next example, so I'm just showing how it maps. Like, yeah, we had a good guess. The next example, the what we found one, this is studying people who are making a personality change, a personal identity change.
Where can I find that one?
You've got it right there. What we found, do you see it at the top part of your screen? Yeah, there you go. And so if you zoom in to, let's see, one of the later images, we've got at the bottom, yeah, those last three on the bottom there: jump into the river, escape and explore, and chart my own path. Those are the three thinking styles that came out of personal identity change. And the chart my own path was, there were a couple of people who were making an identity change that no one else had done at the time. One was changing from physical sex to another physical sex. And it was early days and the hormones weren't available, the process wasn't done, so they were trying to figure it out on their own. Whereas, so that's the idea of chart my own path, whereas the one, the first one is called jump into the river, which is, let's see where I've got the definition, these come laid out funny. But essentially it's, I'm gonna make a personal identity change that I know other people have done and been successful at. So one person wanted to be a boxer as a female. She knows there's a female boxer in the Olympics, and so she was using that kind of as her model. Another person wanted to do weight loss surgery. And even though her family did not support it, she knew a lot of other people who had done it and had been talking with them. Another person was disabled in a wheelchair and wanted to become an activist. So personal identity change. There was a bunch of other ones. The one that was difficult for us in the data was the escape and explore. There were a few people who were very aggressive about describing their personal identity change. And it came from the aspect of, I don't like what I'm undergoing right now. And because I don't like it, I'm going to get out of this context and see if there's another context that I like better. And it took us weeks to figure out, oh, that's what we're seeing in the data. It's their approach to personal identity change was to escape the problem and go expose themselves. All of them traveled, expose themselves to other situations. So this is what I mean, Marco, I don't mean people, individuals, but thinking styles. Yeah. They're not roles. So that's why I put the personal identity change there too, because there's like no role associated. Whereas with a software engineer who's trying to solve a bug or an issue, they're gonna for sure have a role associated with them.
Yeah. So I think this might be where we in the DDD community have a different understanding of or a different definition of the word problem space.
Right.
Where it's not about the single individual or the thinking style, but it's about a group of people on a common purpose that we're trying to help to achieve that purpose. Mm-hmm. But I'm looking at Nick now and hoping to find some confirmation on that.
Which domain-driven design definition of problem space are you referring to?
Yeah, that's exactly my point. Yeah. So
you need to suffix it with the person's name.
Yeah, I think there is a broader range, but there's also a common core to all the domain-driven problem space definitions. But if not, please enlighten me.
I guess if we think about the minimum viable problem space, I would say that's Indy's definition, which is, here is someone with a purpose and they're trying to achieve, they have some aims. And then we can go to the other extreme where domain-driven design says, in the problem space are all of the business processes and concepts needed to solve that purpose conceptually. That will be the subdomains, for example. So I guess that's where things are quite different. I think probably
can't these match or change?
Yeah.
Because core domain or domains are really ambiguous, and thinking in thinking styles, but that also requires, of course, organizational structure to change. Because I think if we look at problem space or subdomains, we usually look at organizational structures or sort of like system structures in the organization with problems, while that's already biased, right? If I understand it correctly.
I think that the subdomain is more in line with what Jabe said, which is this is the symptom definition thing that we are trying to address that is not part of the system that you are building, but it should address it. The issue that I have with the way that DDD looks at it, I think it is short-sighted. So we've gone from blind spot, you didn't see it at all, to now you're myopic because you're not seeing the entire picture, because it's still, like Indy was saying, that your lens, your understanding, your cognition, part of talking to other people is literally to have a brain transplant. And it's really hard and it's really painful, but it's really necessary to literally become, for 5 minutes, that other person and try and channel and look at it with their pair of eyes. And all of a sudden, scales fall off, revelation, you start to see things that you didn't see before. I put a post-it in that Venn diagram. There's a blue one, and then there's a red one right on top of it. I think, and the problem is that this diagram is three-dimensional. I think that the subdomain is a small core that identifies and aggregates the problems that you are addressing, which is part of a bigger problem space, which you may be sharing with other competitors, or you just completely ignore. So I'm not dealing with that. And not acknowledging that then becomes an issue, because you think, oh, yeah, we've addressed everything, we've talked to everybody, it's right there, it's obvious, we just don't see it. So I almost want to draw this in 3D, but I can't do it in Miro. And I think that the subdomain is a subset of related problems that you're promising to address with your solution, and you're linking them directly. So you say, I cover that little red square area of that possible set of solutions that are relevant to that whole problem area. I'm doing that little red salmon square there. Whereas some of what Indy's been talking about is the totality of that first circle, which is every possible problematic problem ever existing with 9 billion people on the planet. And the maturity that Christina was talking about is as we've matured with technology, we've realized you can't just throw out solutions and hope it's going to stick. We need to be more intentional.
Yeah. So I totally agree, and I have a question there. So I just put my thought next to yours. Could it be that things from the solution space become part of the problem space of the future, that it's a function of delta T?
And I'm sure Dave is going to have something to say about that. One of the things that I hear ringing in my ears, Jabe, is when you keep saying, you know, that solution that you created, it's going to change the environment and it's going to create more problems. So yes, Marco.
Thank you.
Marco, there's a really good paper called Why Things Get More Complex, which I'll find and post in the chat.
Oh, thank you very much.
One of the theories that he has in that way of thinking is a socio-technical system theory, right? And one of the things is to say that if we think of a problem, if we think of the what need is trying to be solved for, right? So let's like I like Indy's using the word purpose as opposed to problem, because at least purpose could be positive or negative. Problem always seems to be negative. Sometimes we do things because it's an opportunity, not because it's a problem, right? Anyway, but I use the word need. So you know, some need needs to be fulfilled, and for this author, he basically says that the need could either be a social need, a human need, or it could be a technical need. In which case, what you're looking at is the solution that we're putting in place right now, the intervention that we're taking into the situation in order to stabilize it, improve it, whatever, however you want to describe it, isn't actually to solve a direct user need. It's to stabilize the technology. It's to serve the needs of the technology itself, right? And he argues that complexity arises because we end up patching and patching and patching and patching the technical systems, serving greater and greater technical needs in order just to stabilize the service of the current social need, right? And that if we don't eventually re-examine the technical side of the situation and collapse the complexity of the technical side of the system down, our efforts will be consumed by serving a never-ending amount of technical need, and instead of being able to actually address user need, right? And so he basically is arguing there's this weird balancing act. And one of the things you have to recognize in his theory is that is the need that we're servicing right now, is the solution we're putting in place, is it to solve a problem that's caused by the technology itself, or is it to solve a social need or create a social good? And if we could differentiate those two, then we can, like, in SRE theory, in site reliability engineering theory, the complexity that's caused by trying to continuously patch and solve for technical needs is toil.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we really, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure if we really need to differentiate because, I mean, of course, it's bad to only serve a technical purpose without solving the actual problem of people. But in a socio-technical related world, we need an integral thinking. And the world becomes more and more complex, and our mental models need to become more and more complex to deal with that problem. So at some point, there is no real differentiation between the technological and the human side of things, because the machine parts of a complex system also have needs, as do the human parts, because a whole system has a accumulated need. And yeah, the integral thinking there is, I think.
So I think that the thing that Trist would argue with you about with what you just said is that the reason why he defined it as a socio-technical system, he defined a system with two parts, the social part and technical part, is because it's his belief that these two parts get out of balance, and that's what causes problems. So yes, in an ideal system, the balance would cause the system to appear to be one thing that is working well together. It's when they become disjointed or over one side becomes over demanding of the other side that you get a misbalance, and then you get a bad socio-technical outcome. I mean, that's basically the description of the minds, right? They did a massive technical change without addressing any social issues. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Indy was raising her hand for a minute now.
Yeah,
Indy, please.
I'm doing one of those grade school things where you're like holding up your arm. And I know that I could have just pressed some hand icon somewhere. What Jabe was talking about made me realize, I'm like, okay, some of the vocabulary, the reason why Don is saying we're like talking about the same thing, but the vocabulary isn't matching, I think what it is that we are actually talking about slightly different things. You're talking about how do we talk about this entire problem that we have? And then say Christina is like, how do we actually understand people and pause and take more time to understand people? The vocabulary that I'm bringing to it is only about the pausing and understanding people. It's not about describing the whole domain. So it's a way, so what I've done is I've gone down to the atomic level, which is a person, and then let the data build up from that so that I get the thinking style so that we can have that triad. I think your definition that you mentioned was like, it's a group, I think Marco said a group with a purpose within a context. Yeah. And that's exactly the same place where I end up, but I don't go farther, which is I've got a thinking style group with a purpose and a context. So all I'm doing, and my vocabulary might not be right for the beyond part, but my vocabulary describes how to get that understanding, how to get to that point where you know what a thinking style group is without like coming in and saying, I think the thinking style groups are this. So that's all it is.
I mean, that's one of the main purposes of domain-driven design, right? Or one of the main tools, to have a clearly defined language in a context. So, we just need to figure out the different contexts we have here.
Yeah.
One thing, Don, that you reminded of the 4D, right? So all this conversation reminds me of a model I learned from anthropology I've showed before. I want to dive in a bit to this. Maybe some people see it as well, but what you're discussing, Indy, at the start was like really the bottom left, which they call, I think, emic, right? Just collect microscopically, observe, and informal interviews. And then you go up, which is ethic, and there you make like analysis patterns. And how I always see is that from DDD, we start at the top left corner. It's called the bigger picture. You call it big picture as well. But there's already a judgment being made, or here is where core domain starts to form. But we're never going into the zooming in, right? These individualities and everything. And at some point, we go to the future where we start collecting bounded contexts, or start creating these bounded contexts. And then,
I mean, don't we? What is it that you do when you meet with people and you do an event storming and you really talk about the individual stakeholders in the room, which is why you want to meet with people?
It's what Indy just said. Are you?
Not.
I like to believe
I think we're not. There's already, I know. And that's the top left corner, in my opinion.
Remember my story. Maria, the cleaning floor lady polisher, was not included in the system. Well, I mean, that was just a whole cascade of unintended consequences. The electrician, Maria, us thinking, we know, Indy, your point about opinionated. Happy to give the give back to the slide, but if anyone had said to us right at the beginning that it was not the rack, would have shot them, because there's no way. Hardware does not fail like that, and whatever unexplained, true, but it was not the hardware. And even that question that I asked you, Marco, I do workshops all the time. I wrestle with this, because if that person is not in the room, and the thing I'm going to take away was the thing that Jade said, every so often, just go guerrilla and go to wherever and take a census count of who are the people, what happens in this environment, and then match it against my attendee list. Is everybody who I saw, random selection, there? Yeah. And then I'll do what you were talking about, Marco, where you say, well, what about this? And what about this? Basically help me to take the blinders off and help me to really see and immerse myself in that situation. So I think observation, but deliberate observation, is really important. And a lesson, there's this Charlie Munger book, he talks about how to read something. Use that to read a situation. Do you, what are you seeing? What are people doing? Are they smart? Ask yourself questions and go through, and you start to have a list. And I think over time, it'll become something that's practiced and automatic. And you'll see, and you'll notice things that other people just completely don't even register. One other thing as well, I had this reminded, we receive something like 50,000 signals every second, and we process 0.1% of them. Think about that.
Yeah, thank you. I just had an epiphany, and very much thank you for sticking on that point. I thought of myself like, yeah, no, sure. In the event stormings, we really go into those details and we try to get as much of it as possible. But I was totally blind to the fact that we are in a modeling situation at a whiteboard with sticky notes, not on the factory floor, not in the room with the cleaner.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, I think it's really important, right, to recognize there's nothing wrong with building a tool, and a model is a tool. It's a tool that you think, as DDDers, you think this is a useful tool to help people build better software. But the model is a tool. And, it's not, if you built some feature and you built it and you said, we went in that room and we thought about the feature really carefully, and we talked to a lot of people about the feature and we built it and it's great. And someone didn't say to you, did you like go and see if anybody used it? Did people like it? What did they do with it? If you didn't do any of those things in any other design domain, people would be like, you haven't finished. You're not like building the models, the first start. So like the way to think through that, I think using this kind of loop that you've got here is to think single loop versus double loop, where the single loop would be continuously refining the model and recognizing that is valuable. And the double loop would be going and trying to find disconfirming information that would break the model, right? And so, you know, in Lean, Chris Matz generally thinks that the way that models work, to get to Dawn's theory, is lots of information. Model is basically a filter. The filter tells you what to point at, what to look at, and what not to look at. That's what the model is doing, and so it creates a feedback loop, right? And so the most important thing to realize is if you look at a model that way, if you look at a model as a filter that tells you and shapes the way the organization is paying attention, then the most important thing you're trying to do is constantly break the model so that you can bring new information into the system. And what is the next piece that we can use to like refine, shape, create a better model? And we have to break the model in order to actually offer that opportunity, right? So what are all the disconfirming cases? What are examples where the model doesn't work? All those are opportunities for improving the model as opposed to kind of other kind of confirming cases. And that's that I think that's that double loop. I think the only other, you know, along with this, just because I didn't get this sense the right way. I feel like I didn't get this sense the right way yet. One of the, like the double diamond version of this theory, problem solution theory, which is the classic kind of design theory of problem solution space. One of the things that they talk quite a bit about it, the diamond is expanding and contracting, right? That's the idea. Like start with an idea what the problem is, expand, and then collapse again. And the point of this is to, I think, is often to say, you should always start your project with the assumption that you may not only misunderstand the problem, but that you might have started with the wrong problem altogether. And in fact, one of the, you know, like a lot of design theorists argue pretty regularly, the highest value that a designer can bring to any project is to go back to the sponsor of the project and say, you thought the problem was this, but actually it's this. This is the problem over here. That's not actually the problem. This is. And that's that expand and contract of the space. And I didn't get the sense that I felt like we got the sense that like the space of this problem space that we've been talking about is more like where the parts of the problem exist, as opposed to where the multiple possible understandings of what the problem could be exists, right? That's a different, like a search space of ideas about things versus a search space of the actual kind of catalog of things that are present or something. I don't know.
So I think that one of the things that is absolutely 100% and is built in, I think, to the DNA of DDD is that you have this reinvention and you embrace it. It's probably the first socio-technical community where I've seen that, because when you do the rev for the first time, everybody's excited. Then that's the way it is. Why are you changing it? Why are you upsetting the cart? Why? Rather than ask, how can we improve? How can we change? Because everything is moving. Time is moving on. People are moving on. Things are changing. So adapting to change, well, but not accepting and incorporating change, I think, especially with the kind of complexities that we have, is the only way that we're really going to progress. And those questions that you're asking, I ask all the time, and every single time, you know, it's just human nature. You think, yeah, I got this, I'm done. And I walk into a situation and then I have my ass handed to me. It's like, okay, I should have known that something was going to happen. But that's just part of the process. And you hear people talking about going through the process, it's never tidy. And that whole expand and contract, I do believe, and it's not that you didn't identify a worthwhile problem. There's a more valuable one. Back to the needle haystack thing that we talked about at Christmas, right? And the thing that we need to task ourselves with is that really the needle that we need to go after? First of all, is it, by definition, we have to define it, like, Nick and Marco and Kenny have been saying, yep, it is. Is this the one that we want? Or do we drop this and go risk and go find another one and we don't even know if it's there? That's kind of what we're doing. And with, I think I have a nucleus almost for the bounded context and the whole problem space. I think it's a subdomain is almost the right word. It's a subsection across the related, relevant problems that you're trying to solve, but it's bounded. It's not every single one of them. You've picked one and you try to match that with the conversations and your stakeholders and everybody else and your budget and your time and your constraints. And then you're going to go for it. And this should give you the most value for your investment. And then you still have to measure it, because if you're off track, then you need to be able to say stop. Again, the innovation, the change, and say, okay, we're on the wrong track, course correct, which is always a hard thing to do.
Good.
That's me.
So before we go to Indy, Christina, well, you lowered your hand now. Is there anything you'd like to add, or did Don just filled in?
I wanted to add to what James said, to what Marco said. So I would let Indy to say what she wants to say.
Super quick to what Don said, course correcting and measuring and what Marco's little diagram and the emic perspective and what people are talking about grounded theory, that is exactly what I do. And what data comes out of it, that opportunity map and the thinking styles, they last for decades. They are tools that we use as a map to say, hey, let's start measuring by thinking style, how well we're supporting this particular part of the purpose. And if we can measure by thinking style, we can see, which I've done for a lot of clients, like, oh my God, we've only been paying attention to one of them or none of them. And this goes on for decades, and we hand it on to the next group that takes over from us. It's not a one and done sort of thing. It's a picture that we're continually building and continually using to reference, to measure how much we're changing, how much better we're doing. That's all. Christina.
I just queued me back.
Jake, go ahead. Before
no. I just put myself back in the queue after Indy. It was 10 minutes ago. We talked about how to find the right problem. This is what James said. We can find problems, but we have to make this double loop, not only to redefine our model, but to redesign or redefine the problem. Is this the right problem, what we want to solve? So I think before we talking about mapping, is this really the right problem? And in chat, Nelson said, oh, in the DDD, one thing, everybody thinks about software consultants and developers who are in the DDD community, and they have an organization and they have already a solution. And this was really scary, because if this is the situation, that we should change it, and maybe it's not so important to find the map, but to reorient us and say, okay, why we are doing things, because we have this, we are going DDD, also we have everything to put through the lens of DDD, or it would be totally agreeable to solve problems without software, but by the same team or by the same domain experts or bounded context experts without any software. So is DDD bounded to software? Is DDD bounded to technical maps? Or we can say it is more important to define this problem space and iterate. I hope I wasn't confusing now, because I having the question for 10 minutes already.
So if I understand you correctly, like the question is, what is domain-driven design in this case?
Yeah.
And I find this really hard because I don't think that it means the same thing to everyone. So there are people who say domain-driven design is basically what's defined in the book, and some things may be additional onto that. And there are other people who are very, very vague. And I mean, we had the discussion a few sessions ago where Matthias put it nice to say it's an open set to him. So there's a core of ideas, and then a lot of concepts tend to flow towards this. So it's not a closed set; it's an open set, and that's what I find very nice to say. It's like DDD is a community, a way of thinking. It's like it's multiple ways of thinking that work well together, right? So it's a philosophy and all of that and none of that. A very vague open set, and I'm happy to define it like that, way more than to say, oh, this belongs in and this belongs out. It's not helping anyone. So the why question is important, right? Like, why do you want to define it? What do you want to achieve with it? And if it's to talk about an idea and to make it Googleable, great. If it's to exclude people from joining the conversation, not great. So
exactly, and this is where I'm thinking the whole time, why we have to map it to bounded context? Why not to process a behavior or practice? Why it is this one-to-one relationship so important? For me, it's very, very important to not take a requirement as given, to challenge all this stuff, to challenge even the problems. And now I would challenge it even more, because it's not a need, it's a purpose, it's a level more. And this is, for me, it would be enough. I don't know why we need to, or what we gain with mapping it exactly to DDD concepts.
I think two things personally. Some things are very similar, but not exactly the same. And I think it's important. Remember right at the beginning, I said we're talking about the same things, but with different words. For understanding and collaboration and all the things that are really important to us, we've got to be understood. If you don't define it, then you won't be understood. The second thing that keeps kind of bouncing around my head is, if you look at the past industrial revolution, we had masters at their tools, which were physical things. Our tools today are our freaking brains. And we're now trying to find ways of defining those tools in the toolkit that we use, which, whether it's event storming, whether it's design thinking and scenario mapping, and they're all abstract things that come from our brains that we're trying to make tools for, to be able to express and exchange with each other, because we don't have, like Indy said, telepathy technology. If anyone in this group can make telepathy technology, then I think DD and every other design thinking, whatever thing would be done, because we don't need that anymore. We'll just probably drive everybody crazy. So I see it, Marco, like you. It's a toolkit, and it's important to me that I understand its purpose and intent before I start to bend and break it or injure myself or somebody else with misuse. And that's the reason for the definition, Christina. It's also for communication and for me to be able to collaborate with others. And as long as it gets me, it does the job that so it addresses my need, what I need to do, then I'm good. And I don't care if it comes from socio-technical, domain-driven, TOGAF. I really couldn't give a flying monkeys if it's the appropriate thing. The other day, I had to put together a sequence diagram, and people are like, whoa, you could do that? It's like, there's nothing wrong with it. Yes, it can be, and it has been overused and misused, but they're all valid tools. Just use them appropriately. That's all I wanted to say.
But what are you gaining with it? What are you gaining? Can you say, okay, this is my slice of problem. This is the corresponding bounded context or map or subdomain or whatever definition would be. What is?
It's cheaper to fail, Christina, having a 1-hour conversation, then having to put a plan together, instrument and implement the thing to find out that it didn't work.
No, I meant what are you gaining with this mapping, with this definition, with this fixed. If we define today, this is problem space, this is solution space.
As we understand, and like you said, it's today.
Yeah.
Next year,
Yeah.
it could be totally different.
Okay, good. This disclaimer is good.
Right.
Okay.
So the disclaimer is
Yeah.
it's a snapshot in time.
Yeah. Okay.
The 26th of January 2011.
Okay.
And then from there, remember what Jabe said, we're going to be throwing things at it the whole time, trying to break it, and then eventually it's going to crack. And we're like, okay, everybody, we got to reset.
Okay.
Like one of my responses would be, like, if you go back and look at where Indy started, one of the ways of describing what Indy was doing or is interested in doing, I think, is to notice there's actually 2 different forms of logic that you can use, or multiple forms of logic, but 2 primary ones. There's propositional logic, and propositional logic is like if this, then that, kind of causal logics and stuff like that. The other form of logic is what's called arotetic logic, and it's the logic of questions. And the point here is that there's a logic that defines questions, and the relationships between questions is not the same logic as propositional logic. And so one of the things you could say is, like, design, I think, actually is the relationship between questions and propositions as opposed to problems and solutions. And in the same way, what's interesting about this conversation, problem, solution, etc., is not the answer that we come up with, but whether or not we can create the question that reproduces the conversation that enables more people to kind of think through this for themselves, right? So that, in fact, what we try to do when we refine things, when we refine domains, even I think in DDD land, that relationship of that problem solution thing is more like, do we understand the ground of the questions that what is valid to think about? What's the ontology here? What are the objects? What's the categories of things? Now, what questions can we ask about those things? And how do we know whether those questions are valid questions or not? And then finally, in order to answer those questions, what other questions come up? And then there ends up being an iteration in our arotetic logic where the ground, the domain model itself, is constantly modified by answering the questions that the ground proposes. So there's this cyclical loop that constantly causes an evolution of the ground, right? And one of the ways to understand this is to say boundedness, that thing that is the bounding, it means that it can't be everything. It has to be a subset of possibilities. And so the questions can modify what is validly possible at any moment. And it doesn't necessarily mean, in fact, that the system grows. It could be that some things are added to the ontology and some things are removed from the ontology. It could be that some questions are added or removed, right? And the kind of primary example of this, at least in scientific research, is things like ether. There was thousands of scientists all over the planet that were studying ether, and they had mathematical formulas explaining ether, and they were funded lots of money. People went all the way through their college and got PhDs in ethering, whatever that is. And then one day, Einstein says, nope, ether doesn't exist. And literally all the questions that they were very validly asking yesterday, not valid questions anymore. They just poof, went away. The whole branch of the tree just went away, right? The whole branch of questioning. And so, thinking through the relationship of question and proposition as opposed to problem and solution is a way of trying to think through this idea that the design, the models, the things we make are enacted. They're reproduced constantly. They're not static. Yeah. And in their reproduction, they change and wiggle and move around a little bit. I have this really weird version of it, which is, to really get this idea in your head, you have to imagine every time you walk into your home and you look at your favorite chair, that the chair is proposing a place to sit down. It's not a chair, it's a proposition. What wouldn't you like to sit here? And that you, as kind of a human being, experience the proposition that way. I feel like the chair is inviting me to sit on it, right? And that's the same thing with a model. A good model shouldn't have all the answers in it. It should have good questions that we need to solve, and therefore it becomes progressive. It moves, it evolves. Yeah.
Indeed, you're raising hands.
I have always had a problem with the word problem in the problem solution thing, but I just adopted it because I want to be able, my goal is to get more people doing this and thinking this, which is exactly your goal. And so I'm like, that's why I'm here. I want to understand how to use the right words to say the right thing. And I love this idea of replacing the word problem. I could just replace it with the questions, and replacing the word solution with the word propositions. And it becomes a slightly different thing. I'm not saying that I'm necessarily going to do it, but it's an interesting approach, because now we leave behind this negative idea of a definition of a problem.
I liked your definition where you said it's about the purposes of the people. So I already written down purpose space as a new word.
That would work too. Yeah.
But then I don't have a counterweight on the other side.
I still think, like I said, it's a proposal, right? The whole point of making it into a proposal is that, you know, one of the ways to say this is that designs are always evaluated in use. They're never true in abstraction. They're always evaluated in use. Yeah. In other words, if it's not being used, it's not true or false. It's not, a designed thing is made to be used. So its goodness is only evaluated in use. Therefore, it's always proposing to be used. Yeah, it never is abstractly good.
Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm adjusting my brain to think about these new concepts, and I think Jade's touched on this. A couple of people have touched on this, but I think it's the idea of just like continuous evolution. I'm still trying to work out how that fits in. Yep. I think that's where Jade goes talking about the ground. The ground is constantly changing. I just don't quite grasp where that fits in.
If I can propose something, the way that I think about the ground changing, I mean, I wear glasses, so this is something that I get reminded of all the time, Nick. It's the difference between putting a pinprick in a card and seeing really clearly 360 degrees, or given our physiology and our biology, we can really only see, I think, 140, 150 in front of it. And to be honest, what's in focus is less than that. It's about, 40, 45 degrees. So what's happening when you open the aperture, you get that blurring. You need to put it in focus. Which means that and the reason for the modeling is that you can't, the same way our brains work, we create a model of what we've seen, hold it, and then look somewhere else and take another shot and then stitch this thing together. That is the ground change. So it's not literally the physical ground, it's more your perception and your view. Everything is in sharp focus and you can really see it. And the problem with the assumptions and to some extent, what Christina was saying about the way that definitions might hamper us is that if you don't make space for it to grow, move, change, then eventually you're going to get stuck because it's going to be old. So it's more, I think about it more as in being in focus. I sit and I think about what would it be like to be able to see 360 degrees clearly for 5 meters. I mean, that's just mind-boggling.
And then you haven't looked up and down.
There's no up and down. You can see it's 360 degrees 3D all the way around, like right? Yeah. So again, I know it's just an analogy, but that's what I kind of heard, and I substituted for the expanding ground. It's what can I see, what can I perceive, and That's influenced by our mental models, it's influenced by our experience, it's influenced by the things that we know. I'm sure you heard about the experiment where a gorilla runs through a set of people dancing, and you ask people to count the white t-shirts, how many people are moving and all the rest, and very few people, but I think it's 17% of people actually see the gorilla. Everybody else didn't. That's the 99.999% of signals that fell on the floor. What we're trying to do.
Same is done with radiologists. Put a big gorilla in the image.
I did a project based on that. Very interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. So looking at the time.
Can I propose something to Nick really quickly?
Yeah.
One of the things that I think to get evolution in your mind is, I think designers don't take themselves seriously enough. And this is what I mean by it. Do you guys do domain-driven designing because you believe it will improve things in the world? It will change the world? Is that why you do it? Yeah. So therefore, if you did it better, you'd change the world more. And isn't the model supposed to be modeling the world? So the better you get at this, the more change you're causing in the world. Therefore, do you see, like, the model is supposed to reflect the thing that you're intervening in, and therefore there's a flow back and forth.
The matters at work, right?
Yeah, and you have to think through that. To the extent where what eventually I think happens is that you get this idea that the mistake is to think that we need to make the model more and more detailed in order to improve it. And what we need is the right level of detail to cause the change that we want to see in the world. And then we need to not make it any more detailed than that, because we know that we have to iterate it constantly. And the more detailed it is, the harder it is to iterate. So to keep it malleable and movable, blah, blah, like to make the model capable of evolution is part of making it not brittle, not making it fracture, not making it come apart. And in the language that I use, I think one of the biggest problems with the relationship between realism and idealisms, where models are idealisms, is that it takes energy and time and effort to make the model coherent. And if you put too much detail into just making the model coherent and not checking that it's correspondent with the reality that it's describing anymore, you delaminate the model away from reality. And then you have people in your organization whose entire job is just to, like, make the model better. and they're making it worse, right? Because they're just making it internally coherent. They're making the model capable of defending itself, as opposed to making it capable of modifying the reality the way you want it to. Yeah, does that make sense?
It's something I've heard about culture. Culture also has this way of sticking and being like this thing that goes coherently, but that makes it so that at some point you'll have a revolution, hopefully.
That's right.
It has a way to stick and to just freeze and not change. And I think Eric Evans also said, like, the arch enemy of design is perfectionism.
Yep. The original J-curve, which is not the one that you see in Agile these days, but the original J-curve was a description of the cause of a revolution. And it was literally the event was when the delaminating of the perception of the ruling class's model of reality and the experienced reality of the people actually living it diverged so much that it's intolerable, right? And might I say that maybe some architects have had this experience in their lives, where they have a model, they insist that it's right, and the developers are like, that has nothing to do with what we're doing right now, dude. Go away. Anyway.
Yeah. So the thing I like what Rebecca also said, postpone decisions as far away as possible. That's a heuristic I like. If you can postpone the decision, do so.
We still have to know the problem.
I hope I quote her.
We still have to. We still have to know the problem space. We cannot postpone the problem space. This is why I think this is really important. We have to know the problem, but our solution can be iterable, and then we can find out more about the problem. But still, from the start on, we have to say, what are you telling me is a mental solution? Please tell me about the problem. Apropos challenging, always challenging, because even you and me had this discussion about if a user wants to come onto the website and fill in some forms, and I told you, no, he doesn't want to fill in some forms. He just wants to use a service. He has to fill in some forms because this is our solution for him. But he never ever wants to fill in these forms. He just wants to buy something without filling anything. But he cannot because we are not able to give him a better solution.
This is the entire UK right now, by the way. We don't want to fill out those forms.
Yeah.
I'm working with the digital office in the UK. They're starting to do a lot of this kind of research.
Nobody wants.
Looking at the time, we have 8 minutes left, right? We have more questions, I think, than answers about. Yeah, CJ.
Thanks, Jay.
but looking at Marco, and this is already almost all the DDD workshops I do. They pose more questions, but are the concepts of core, subdomain, supportive domain, problem and solution space any more helpful or more clear to the community now, or should we just throw them out? What do you think?
I like Marco's idea of calling the problem space the purpose space. And by doing that, that kind of addresses what Christina was just saying, which connects to what Jabe was just saying, maybe?
Yeah, I was just asking the whole Twitterverse if for an alternative for solution space then, because we're missing the counterweight. Having a purpose space and a solution space sounds kind of weird.
Why?
Thank you for the question. That is a very good question. Because solution, it's my bias, but when I hear solution, I'm looking for problems that solution fits to. So it's a predetermined bias because I was trained that way. And
but
I think a lot of developers
Jib gave you the answer. It's his chair is your solution. A proposal.
Other thing
you have a purpose and you have a proposal.
Proposal. Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing you should hear when you hear problem solution, or what I hear, is that the solution closes the problem loop, that it like somehow neutralizes. I always think of it like problem solution with an equal sign in the middle, right? Like balanced, right? And part of what I'm saying is like actually solutions don't do that. Often they create other problems, or they only solve part of the problem, or they're not actually like stable end states. Usually they move still, and that's why they end up being proposals. They have to be evaluated in relationship to the other proposals you're hearing and things like that. So I don't know.
It totally takes away the determinism of this is the solution. Like it makes it an open discussion that, and this also aids in the evolutionary development, because you have proposals and they need to be refined to fit the purpose, because the purpose is changing and shifting over time, all the time. You need to change and shift the proposals that fit to that. I love that.
Yeah, but it's also based on the feedback that you now have because you have that solution. Because you didn't have that solution.
And now it's balanced because it's both is PS.
What?
Purpose space, proposal space, proposal space. Yes, balance.
Do not end the session with this.
This is the model, right?
Are you aware?
So actually, the thing that needs to be added to that is that it has movement and it's dynamic.
Yeah.
So it's actually oscillating, right? And you're adding energy to keep it that intersection. If you don't, what happens is that over time, it separates and the purpose is moved on. Your solution is still here. It no longer addresses whatever it was supposed to. So then you have to bring it up.
Yeah.
So we can still have the definitions, but the implementation is not static. So that's what I've taken away from this. I was thinking about this just as a 3D, but there's actually motion and energy involved in there, and balancing. And it could separate at any point, and you have no idea what's going to do that, and you have to be prepared for that and then mitigate against that. So Wow.
Kind of like when your washing machine goes out of balance.
Right, exactly.
So we got that. We haven't dived into the rest yet. I think we need another session for that. But I think this was a wonderful session. What do you think, Marco?
Yeah, I love it. I really want to write down stuff now and need to work through ideas. Yeah, thanks everybody. This was delightful. Yeah. Really delightful.
Thank you, everybody. I've got to do what Marco's doing. I've got a whole afternoon to do it.
And we solved the problem. We don't have to map it anymore because we have new names.
Yeah, we don't have a problem anymore. We have purpose.
We don't have a problem
we have
anymore.
To come up with new ones, Christina. Right?
It doesn't matter. This problem was solved.
We just rebranded it, right?
Doesn't matter.
Like everything.
It was
same
great.
problem, different name. Great.
It was great. I loved it. I hope. I loved it. It was perfect.
Great. So let's close it off. Hopefully until next time. And thank you all for tuning in. And hope you enjoyed. And see you next time. And thanks for everyone for joining in. This was a lovely thing. And I'm going to stop the live stream, but we're going to stay a bit who can in the Zoom meeting.